Okay, hey guys. So I know we talk a lot about like woo and spooky stuff and UFOs and all of that. And that's fun. No lie, I believe in that stuff. But today we're talking about something that is serious and real. And we're talking with a real scientist. So we got to put on our serious hats because we're talking about bird flu. I'm going to intro this conversation with a little history and backstory of Los Angeles's track record timeline of pandemics. And the truth is, Los Angeles has been a cesspool of diseases and epidemics as far back as the 1700s, when European colonizers first started bringing animal domestication practices to the San Fernando and San Gabriel missions. And by the way, we talk about this and the whole genocide of California in the episode 9 and episode 10 of the podcast. This week, we're covering what will likely happen with Los Angeles's next major epidemic, which is bird flu, with Dr. Crystal Heath, who is my sister and who has the same voice as me. So it's going to get kind of confusing and fun on this episode. But say hi, Crystal.
Hello.
Can you give us a brief, maybe 1 or 2 sentence pitch of why bird flu is something that we should be really concerned about?
Well, in short, Gavin Newsom has declared a state of emergency. It has led to the extermination of 2/3 of our egg-laying hens in California. It has infected around 700 of our 1,100 dairy herds here in California. Now cats are dying because of drinking raw commercial milk and raw pet food. And many people are worried that it could lead to the next pandemic.
And would it be really serious for humans?
It potentially could be, because in the past, around 50% of infected people have died. Now we have had 66 people infected nationwide, and nobody has died yet. It's mostly been related to eyes, but there was a very serious
And you
illness.
say related to eyes, like it makes your eyes like...
Yeah. Like we were told, oh, it's just mild conjunctivitis. And then the photos came out in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it showed this worker with red, hemorrhagic. Basically, the whites of the eyes were red from blood. And it was horrifying. It wasn't just like, oh, your eyes are a little red because you have allergies, which we were all sort of envisioning when they were talking about mild conjunctivitis. It was like red sclera, red whites of your eyes. It was awful. And now this teenager in British Columbia, we were told, oh, she's in critical condition, and not sure how she got it. But then the report just came out in the New England Journal of Medicine of everything she went through. And she was placed on ECMO, which is extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, basically a lung and heart bypass machine, which is very, very serious. And we don't have very many of those.
Is that at all related to the iron lung that polio patients
it's
put into?
It's a little bit like iron lung. I think of like old school ventilator, and ventilator is basically you have a tube in and you're breathing. And the iron lungs were basically sort of like you lay in them and it vacuumed your chest out and in mechanically.
Okay.
A ventilator, a person's on, like they have a tube down their trachea and they have a machine pumping their lungs from the inside. ECMO is where your blood is taken out of your body, oxygenated, and put back in. And this is like, it can lead to brain damage in people. Like a lot of people never are fully normal after undergoing this. It's very expensive. We only have so many of those machines. And if everybody gets sick with H5N1 and has to do ECMO, we could not do that. It takes a lot of resources. So that's scary. And then there's another person in Louisiana who handled an older man who handled dead birds on his property, who is now in critical condition. So nobody's died yet, but a couple of people have gotten very, very sick.
And they would die without that treatment. And it would be really hard to do that sort of treatment on a wide scale, right?
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are worried. Yeah.
We're going to dive deep into bird flu. But first, I'm going to do a quick overview of LA's history of epidemics. And yes, there have been infectious diseases in North America prior to the arrival of Europeans. Syphilis is one possible example of a disease that was here before Europeans came over. But the smaller populations and the limited number of domestic animals and infrequent interactions between populations reduced transmission. And I was tempted to cover the whole missionary period, which is 1769 to 1833, since that's when so many people died. But it's really hard to tell what deaths were caused by diseases and which were caused by murder and torture and all the bad stuff. So the too long didn't read is during this period, late 1700s, early 1800s, there was a lot of dysentery, vague fevers, typhus, measles, smallpox, venereal diseases. Much of that caused by the mission system's system, which was to convert natives from the nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a permanent dwelling, living in close quarters, raising animals in confinement system. And it was a bad time. But I do think what's really interesting is that Indigenous people believe that disease was caused by being out of balance. And that is essentially what everything post-missionary system in California has been. It's been about raising animals in confinement, increasing human populations, keeping humans sedentary in a area where they live close together. And in that environment, diseases can flourish. So quick history from 1829 to 1833, and then from 1849 to 1855, there were huge cholera epidemics. 150,000 Americans died, and some of that disease making it to LA. Then the Great Plains smallpox epidemic spread across the West, eventually reaching Los Angeles in 1840. And it wiped out a majority of each tribe's populations on its spread westward. From 1862 to 1863, there was an incredibly massive smallpox epidemic in Los Angeles that started with indigenous populations. And because it was affecting indigenous populations, no one cared. And it quickly spread to the settlers, though. And eventually 14 people per day would die at the height of the epidemic. And we had vaccines at this point. And so we could have vaccinated everyone to stop smallpox. But understandably, there were a lot of people who didn't want to take the smallpox vaccine. It was a 2-part vaccine. People had to take it twice. So getting people to do the 2-part thing was hard. But also the indigenous people were very wary of doing vaccines, understandably. And then there was a cult leader in Los Angeles. We're going to do a whole story about him who basically was an early anti-vaxxer and told people not to do the vaccines. So that could have been wiped out back then, but because it wasn't, then from 1868 to 1869, there was another very deadly smallpox epidemic. And then it would crop up again in 1877, 1884, and 1887. So an example of herd immunity not working. If people were not vaccinated against smallpox, they would be affected. And from 1889 to 1890, the Russian flu hit Los Angeles, and 13,000 Americans total died during that period from the Russian flu. From 1916 to 1927, we got the sleeping sickness, which is a crazy disease, which people went to sleep in the 1920s, and some of them woke up in the 1960s. And that's all talked about in Oliver Sacks' amazing book, Awakenings. But 500,000 Americans died from that disease. And during that same period, 1918 to 1920, that was when Spanish flu was raging. And actually in Los Angeles, we were pretty smart, and we launched an education campaign. We were quick with quarantining. We did school closures. And so in Los Angeles, only 464 people per 100,000 people died versus San Francisco, which San Francisco did masking, but they weren't quick with all the other things. And they had 673 people per every 100,000 die. And then from 1924 to 1925, Los Angeles had a pneumonic plague outbreak, which killed 30. And then right after that, so the 1920s had three kind of big pandemics going on at the same time. And then right away in the 1930s, that's when polio crops up. And polio is a terrible, painful, terrible, awful disease. And if you just do a Google search of polio pictures, I'm not going to describe it, but I'll describe it a little. It's people with like extremely bent and deformed limbs, and it's extremely painful and terrible. And it first cropped up in 1934, and then again in 1938, and then again in 1946, and then again in 1942. Our president at the time had polio, and every year it cropped up between 20,000 and 57,000 cases came up per year, and it ended in 1957 with a vaccine, and it ended completely in the Western Hemisphere in 1979. And then that brings us to 1981, when the CDC finally classified AIDS as an epidemic. And AIDS is still happening. It's still a thing. It's survivable now, but people can still get it. And that brings us to 2019 with COVID-19, which they stopped, as far as I know, they stopped tracking how many people died. But I could tell from the last tracking on the LA County website that in Los Angeles, 36,317 people have died from COVID-19 and millions worldwide. So from what I've read, Crystal, bird flu is now showing up in LA's wastewater. Where do you think bird flu will end up landing on LA's history of epidemics? Like, how bad will it get?
It's really hard to say at this point, and I feel like a lot of people want me to speculate, but there's a lot of people out there who are very suspicious of the government and think this is all some sort of tactic to control us and put masks on, and
which is actually something that happened in the first smallpox epidemic in the 1860s. People got like pandemic fatigue after the first wave, and they're like, it's not happening. We're not going to believe that it's happening because we're tired of it. And so we're going to live our lives.
Yeah. And this is especially bad because back in 2004, we had an avian influenza outbreak, and all of the headlines were like, this is going to be bad. It's going to be the next pandemic. And because it didn't materialize into a Spanish flu type scenario, now people are using that as a reason to not take this seriously. But and now since Gavin Newsom declared a state of emergency, people hate Gavin Newsom, because he, told everybody to stay at home and mask and everything during COVID while he's out going to the French Laundry. So people don't really trust what he says. But I mean, like I said, by the time we declared a state of emergency, we had 60% of California dairy herds infected and 50% of egg layers were infected. Now 2/3 of our egg layers are exterminated because of bird flu, and grocery store egg shelves are empty. And California imports about 40% of our eggs. So that's why there's still some eggs on the shelves. But yeah, I mean, I think we also have to emphasize that other governors, like Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds, who's a Republican on the other end of the political spectrum, also extended her avian influenza disaster proclamation in Iowa. So it's not just a political thing. So I don't want to speculate, but I did, back on November 7th, I published a piece in the Mercury News and the East Bay Times titled "California's Bird Flu Exposes an Existential Threat in the Nation's Largest Dairy State." And some people, criticized me for using the term existential threat and all of this. But now I feel like there's more messaging, and people are saying, they're still saying the risk to the public is low. Don't worry, the meat, milk, and eggs are safe.
They're saying that because the companies want you to buy stuff still.
Yeah, there's just this culture of like, we have to maintain consumer trust and confidence. And there's still like, whenever, they're criticized for, what do you guys say back in 2004? This is going to be a big deal. How can we believe you now? I think we're all like gaslit into not wanting to make this a big deal.
Okay. Question about 2004 though. Did the 2004 bird flu affect sea life and affect mammals?
That's the thing. It did not affect dairy herds. We did not lose as many poultry birds as we have in the United States. Now we've lost 130 million have been exterminated due to avian influenza. So yeah, it is a little bit different.
But I remember back in 2022, like, wasn't it sea lions and sea mammals were being affected by bird flu and dying?
Yeah.
So it's mutated now for almost 3 years into different. So that's bad.
Yeah. This multi-species outbreak is a little bit unprecedented for sure.
And so it could vary, and it's now in humans, which was the previous bird flu in humans.
Yes, it was. It did affect humans, but yeah, I mean, and still it's like in early December, scientists at Scripps Research, they isolated a virus from the first human infection from a cow strain in Texas. And they found this mutation Q226L that improved the ability of the HA protein to attach to receptors on human cells. But they want to emphasize that this does not mean that the virus is on the verge of the next pandemic. That's what they said. And it was found that the genetic sequence of the virus that infected the Canadian teenager who was on ECMO and hospitalized and everything had also undergone mutational changes. And they think that this virus underwent these mutations during the course of her infection. So H5N1, this is the virus, the hemagglutinin, which is the H of the H5N1, binds to cells with receptors that are known as alpha 2,3, which are abundant in wild birds and domestic poultry. But they're also found in the conjunctiva and of the tissue surrounding human eyes. And the receptors that predominate in the human upper airways are known as the alpha 2,6. The type of human influenza A virus is H1N1 and H3N2 attached to. And it's thought that to become a virus capable of spreading easily among people, H5N1 would need to acquire the ability to attach to this type of receptor. So the two mutations spotted in the Canadian teenager's virus are known to help flu viruses make this attachment switch. So
how close are we to becoming a pandemic?
So here's the thing. There's two things that you need in order to make a virus that is of pandemic potential. And these are susceptibility and permissivity. And susceptibility refers to whether the virus can enter and infect the cell. And permissivity refers to whether the virus can replicate once it gets in. And virologist Angela Rasmussen at the University of Saskatchewan says that the virus hasn't quite gotten the permissivity part yet. Virus replication depends on interacting with a lot of host cellular machinery. And if it can't hijack the cell, then no other progeny viruses are made. So she's not super worried yet about these mutations in this British Columbian teen. But she is worried about the growing number of human cases and the chance for reassortment with the seasonal flu virus, which, if that happens, that could cause the next pandemic.
And so what's reassortment?
Reassortment. So the influenza virus has 8 strands of RNA. And if you have a virus, a seasonal flu virus, infect the same cell as the H5N1 virus, you have 2 viruses in the same cell, then the viruses swap genes and then they can develop the ability to transmit from person to person. So
there you go. And so how dangerous can bird flu be for humans?
So now that the seasonal flu season has picked up, I have a lot of human doctor social media followers, and they are saying the flu season is especially bad this year. And I'm always typing, they're showing x-rays of kids with really bad pneumonia. And I'm like, what's the H5N1 status? Did you test for H5N1? I think a lot of doctors still aren't testing for it. So we don't know. And in the past, this virus had a 50% case fatality rate. And now we've had all these people infected. Nobody's died yet. But this girl from British Columbia, she nearly died, was placed on ECMO. And this man in Louisiana is in critical condition. And so it could get really bad. If it were to develop all the mutations it needs, if it were to reassort with the seasonal flu virus, it could be bad for people.
So let's take things back a little bit. Where did bird flu come from and why is it so bad?
So there's been several outbreaks of H5N1 in the past, and it first emerged in 1997 in Hong Kong, and it caused severe human illness, widespread extermination of commercial poultry birds. And this was the first documented instance of direct transmission of H5N1 from birds to humans. And that's led to 6 human deaths. And then you had the global spread from 2003 to 2005. And this was the one where everybody's like, this is going to be the next Spanish flu. And that didn't really materialize, but we had human cases had high mortality rates, as high as 60%. Millions more birds were exterminated to contain the virus. It mainly happened in Asia, Europe, Middle East, Africa. So then this most recent outbreak is from the variant classified as H5N1 2344B. And this strain initially emerged in farmed poultry in, I don't know how you say this, but Guangdong, China in 1996. And it underwent sort of continuous evolution through genetic drift and reassortment while circulating within Eurasia and Africa over the past 20 years. And then in late 2021, those birds that were infected crossed the Atlantic, which led to a dramatic increase in the scope and the impact of this virus. And now we've lost more than 130 million commercially raised poultry birds. And there's been a number of species infected, including dolphins, skunks, dogs, cats, seals, sea lions, deer, bears, horses, cats, squirrels, and dairy cows and more. And even in Argentina, 96% of elephant seal pups born in the 2023 breeding season died of H5N1. Oh my God. So it's really bad.
Not to bring the woo back into this, but you said 1997, and 1997 was the last time Saturn went into Aries, and Saturn is going into Aries in a few months. And so it's going to be the Saturn return of bird flu. And then Neptune is going to enter Aries, and Neptune and Saturn are going to be together, conjunct, and Neptune is about dissolving boundaries, and it's a planet that's associated with disease. So you said that, and I was like, oh my goodness.
Wow.
But I'm going to try and make this a scientific episode. We're not going to bring the woo into this too much, but we are having the Saturn return of bird flu, and it is conjunct Neptune. And that just to me is like, that is a big sign that I think we are in for something, especially August 2025.
We'll see.
We'll see. Okay, so but back to serious hat now. We're just going to science this. How long have you been following bird flu, and how did you come to first find out about it?
So I've been following it since the beginning of this current outbreak, when it became public in February of 2022. But I've been looking and digging into the records of how much these companies have made in bailouts from bird flu. And from our records, it looks like a Jennie-O turkey store facility was infected in late 2021. And that's when our records show them receiving indemnity payments. But I think my first article about it was published in March of 2022 and in the Fresno Bee. And I was talking about the pandemic risk of this virus. So, yeah.
And so if you are an audience member listening and you're thinking, wow, these farmers are having to kill off their whole flocks when this bird flu hits and all these cows are dying, how are these people possibly staying in business? Hold on to that question, because we're going to come back to that. And that's a really important thing to think about, how our whole food economic system is in this country and how it maybe needs to be improved a little bit, just a little bit. But why hasn't there been the news coverage that you would expect for something that is potentially, or that is really so serious?
Yeah, well, now there's been more coverage since the state of emergency, since the egg shelves being empty, since cats have died. I feel like more people are finally starting to talk about it. But I think, as this emerged, there were just few trusted experts going to the media with an interesting perspective to share. Because when an outbreak happens, the ag departments make this boring press release assuring the public that the meat, milk, and eggs are safe, that this isn't a big deal. They're handling this. And the media really doesn't look much further. But we've been trying to get this to the media more and inform them about these issues. And we got a piece on the front page of the New York Times about the bailout that these corporations got. And we've been sending updates to the press. We've got photos of dead cows in Vanity Fair. But it's been really hard to get sort of more coverage about the financial aspects of this, which I found surprising because I think it's a really interesting angle. But I think the media just feels safe just reciting the same narrative for the government agencies that the risk to the public is low, the food supply is safe. And it's strange how few media outlets are really willing to interrogate this further. And I think it's because so many don't know how to trust what to believe, especially after COVID. No one wants to write something that is going to be debunked later. And it's easy to just go to the government and industry and get their narrative and publish that. And it might also play a role of like, who's their advertisers? Are their advertisers these animal agriculture companies and pharmaceutical companies that don't?
And also who owns the paper? Like in the case of Washington Post, Jeff Bezos owns that.
Yeah.
And so he obviously wants Amazon to do well. And he also wants to make friends with Trump.
Yeah. I mean, I'm grateful, like Washington Post published a video about me, like taking photos of cows. So that was good, but they didn't say a lot of the other things. They didn't include a lot of the other things that I said about, the risk of animal agriculture and how it poses a threat to create the next pandemic and how we need to scale down animal agriculture. They didn't include any of that, but they include me taking pictures of cows. So
what needs to happen in order to contain this? And why isn't that happening?
Well, we need more testing. And I think, researchers in labs are doing this gain of function testing. And all of our resources seem to be
what's gain of function
gain
testing?
Of function is where you take a virus and you cause it to mutate. You add mutations to it that could make it more likely to spread to people so that you could see what that looks like. But we're already doing gain of function is happening in the real world right now. And we're not following it because we're too busy looking at infecting animals in a lab instead of doing actual testing on animals in the field who are getting sick and the virus is mutating in them. So I think we need more testing of all animals near farms. We're just doing bulk milk tank testing of farms around who are in a 10-kilometer circumference of infected facilities. We're not testing individual cows. Carcasses.
Why is it important to test individual cows?
I think we would get a good idea of how the virus is acting and how it's mutating in individual cows on a farm and how it's being spread from cow to cow on a farm. We still don't really know how that is. We presume it's from milking machines, but we don't know. We don't know how it's being spread from facility to facility. We know it's being spread between cows, maybe via the milking machines, but how is it getting from one farm to another? And by doing more testing of individual cows, we might be able to determine that.
I mean, is it spreading through like insects and birds? Is that like a theory?
This has been a strong debate on my Twitter between multiple very smart people have been debating this subject. And one person says, no, there was a pinpoint point when a cow was infected by a bird. And since then, the virus has spread between cows and it hasn't. But there's evidence to show that it has gone back to birds and birds have then infected cows again. But there's some debate among virologists whether that happened or not and whether birds really are transmitting this between facilities. I think it's possible that birds are like a vector, like they're carrying the virus on them, maybe, and spreading it, or insects are, or dust could be a possibility. But yeah, there's a lot of controversy because there's just not enough testing done and there's a lot of speculation. And we just need more resources to do more tests. These carcasses, these cows are dying and then they're just being rendered. Nobody's looking at their bodies.
Well, and they're also being kind of left out on the side of the road.
Yeah. And that's what I took pictures of, I think.
And why is that a problem?
These cows were just left out, uncovered, no signs telling people of the risk, and they were covered in flies. Flies could potentially transmit it. Birds, scavengers, could feed on the carcasses and spread it. But yeah, no signs anywhere. But of course, the dairy industry said, well, we need to leave them out on the side of the road so that the rendering trucks can pick them up without spreading disease onto the farm. But you're also leaving out to animals who can spread the disease on the farm. And in fact, one reporter who went to an area where I took photos of dead cows found a dead cow in the same area where I shot pictures of, and also found a dog nuzzling the carcass that was there. That didn't make it into the media report, which I thought was interesting because that's kind of an interesting story, but it didn't make it into his report. But yeah.
It reminds me of the subsequent smallpox outbreaks because they would put like either the dead, mostly Native Americans, in just giant piles or pits, and the bodies are still contagious. And then they would also just dump the bodies in the river.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And people would drink water from the river.
Oh, my gosh.
Horrifying. So
you're not even allowed to compost cow bodies in California because, especially Central Valley, because the water level is so low that there's a risk of contamination. Yeah.
And are the farm workers using safety measures to protect themselves?
We know. I mean, some are and some aren't. Are
they being educated at least?
I don't know. So that's a concern. I've seen no signs anywhere educating the public about the risk. When I'm driving across the Central Valley, and we took pictures of workers at a facility where they mass exterminated poultry, and one worker wasn't wearing a mask. One worker was wearing a mask below his nose. My concern is, are they having a hard time finding workers? So they don't want to scare off workers by really informing them that, hey, you got to be careful. This is a risk. You could get sick. So they're really downplaying it and just repeating the CDC narrative. The risk to the public is low. Don't worry. So they're not taking it seriously. So they're not wearing the proper equipment. We know the state has distributed PPE, but are the workers really being informed about the risk and told to wear them properly? That's a concern.
The workers are marginalized. So if they do get sick, they are likely still coming to work because they don't want to lose their jobs.
Yeah. And that was a big concern the United Farm Workers was working on, because if they test positive, it used to be they were concerned that, they'd have to self-isolate for 10 days. And that would mean that they wouldn't get paid. But under California's workman's comp, they should. Even if you're not here legally, you should be eligible for workman's comp. But I think a lot of farm workers were worried that they couldn't be. There was no declaration made that was for sure a thing. But recently in the media, the Western United Dairies wanted to assure everybody that they would be compensated if they took time off work. But yeah, that's why a lot of workers were refusing testing, and they were telling each other how to not consent to testing. So that we lost a lot of information there.
Yikes. A major contributor of this disease and many diseases is intensive farming practices. What is the history of these kind of practices, and how long has this been going on in California?
So the emergence of factory farming really came about in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, but then World War I hit. And so all of the Allied forces in Europe, people left the farms in Europe to go fight in the war. And so America needed to pick up the slack and feed the Allied forces in Europe. So they really ramped up. We need to produce more meat at a really efficient scale to ship over to Europe. And meat was the best option for shipping at the time. And companies like Cargill really took advantage of this. There's a surplus of grain. Cargill makes a lot of money selling grain to livestock. They took
basically advantage. like these companies, they make more money feeding animals than feeding humans.
Yeah, it's a really good way to upsell grain into higher value calories, basically, because grain is pretty cheap. If you just feed people grain, it's like now, but you have
we could end world hunger feeding people grain. Yeah,
you really expand your market if you feed it to animals. and then people eat the animals. So Cargill really profited off of this. They got a lot of great government contracts too along the way. And now, of course, Cargill is one of the biggest companies in the world, has 21 billionaires, pretty much all your food in your pantry. Cargill had its mitts in somehow. So yeah, companies like Cargill really expanded after World War I. This led to,
and by the way, Google the most evil company in the world, and you will get a really great Mother Jones article about Cargill and just the extent of all the evil things that Cargill has done to maintain its monopoly on our food system and the terrible things it's done in other countries. Check it out. Yeah. I'll drop a link in the show notes.
But yeah, I mean, in the early 1920s, 1930s, you had the advent of vitamins A and D, which allowed poultry birds to be raised indoors, so you could intensify chicken production that way. But then in California, especially after the Dust Bowl or during the Dust Bowl, people migrated from the Oklahoma area, Dust Bowl areas, to California and the Central Valley. And that really spurred the growth of factory farming here and agriculture here. But in the 1940s, interestingly, like you had the whole Executive Order 9066, the whole Japanese internment thing where we put 100,000 Japanese Americans in concentration camps. And the Turlock Assembly Center was one Japanese internment camp at the Stanislaus County Fairgrounds. So we had a lot of Japanese Americans were taken off their farms. Their property was taken from them. They were farmers in the Central Valley. So their farms obviously went to those in positions of power who got their farms.
Oh, wow. So they you straight up, just like in Gaza, like with the Palestinians, like losing their land and their land just being given away. Like the same, we did the same thing in the last century. We took Japanese people's land and we're like, it belongs to the companies now.
Yeah. And I'd love to look into like, what exactly happened to these individuals' property? Like, who did it go to? I haven't quite dug that up yet. But also, interestingly enough, you had the prison system in the Central Valley is huge. You have Corcoran, which is like one of the most famous ones. You have Sirhan, Charles Manson were there. This is a facility that the first thing before the main Corcoran prison started was the Corcoran Prison Dairy Facility, which was operated by the California Prison Authority since the late 1940s. Now, Corcoran State Prison wasn't started until 1988. So like the dairy was before the actual prison. And so they have a herd of like 300 dairy cows. The inmates there earn between 35 cents and 95 cents an hour. And the profit.
So these dairies are running on slave labor from the incarcerated people.
Yeah.
Which now that like it's becoming pretty much illegal in California to be homeless, I wonder if that is going to be like a really effective way to get more free labor.
I don't know. We'll see. I mean, there's so many prisons. There's like a Visalia prison. There's a Wasco State Prison. Wasco is right near where Central Valley Eggs is, where there is a big depopulation with like 2 million birds were depopulated there.
Oh my God. This is just like blowing my mind because this happened in the 19th century, in the 1800s. So what California did when it first became a state, one of the first laws that it passed was it made it illegal to be a so-called drunken Indian. What that meant was any California citizen, any American citizen could point out an indigenous person who they didn't like or who wasn't working, and that indigenous person would then be sent to prison. And that's all it took, was just one person being like, I don't like that Indian. And then in order for these indigenous people who didn't have any money to pay to their bail, like a farmer could pay the bond of an indigenous person, and that indigenous person would then have to work off their bond by working as free labor for the farmer, either for like the winery or the dairy or the farmer who was doing his thing. So we now are doing the exact same thing again, where it's like we're arresting people so that we can have free labor for the farmers.
Yeah.
Blowing my mind.
Yeah, it's a really interesting subject to dig into. And I don't know if you've ever watched the show Yellowstone, but like Yellowstone very much glorifies like the ranching culture and everything. But they also specifically mentioned, like at one point, he's like, oh, we need to get more workers. Well, go to the prison. Like they just like out in the open, like, and it's not even a thing. Like, oh yeah, we'll just hire prison labor.
That's the one area where slavery is still legal. And then we, like in our last election, we had on the ballot, we can make slavery illegal. We can make prison slavery illegal. And we, as a state, we voted that down. We said, no, we think slavery should still be legal. Blowing my mind.
Yeah.
But the way that this is history repeating itself from what happened in the 19th century when California first became a state. Oh my fucking
How do we break the cycle? Like I don't know. But yeah, that's what happened. And the growth of animal agriculture here in the Central Valley is just boomed over the past 30 years. Now we have these dairy digesters. The state taxpayers actually funded these huge dairies to build these dairy digesters. And now many dairies make more money selling low carbon fuel standard credits by capturing the methane from the poop lagoons and selling those to fossil fuel companies than they make by selling milk. So, and we paid for it. And that's what led to more intensification of animal agriculture.
It's really not even like a food system anymore because so much of it is, milk on its own wouldn't be like a sustainable business model if it wasn't getting the subsidies from the government, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, like really, 73% of dairy revenues come from some form of subsidy. It's not like you can be a conscientious objector to this. And if you don't eat cheese or dairy, you're not funding them. You still have to pay the worst companies with the lowest animal welfare practices. Or if you I only buy local milk, you're still paying for the largest dairies. Yeah.
And not to mention like the school milk program, the fact that really people who are not white can't digest milk. Like most people can't digest milk, but milk is guaranteed in the schools, like because the government says every school should have milk. Yeah. Not every school should have juice or fruit or whatever, but every school should have milk. Every kid is going to drink milk, regardless of if you're lactose intolerant or not.
And you have to get like a special note to not drink milk if you want soy or something else. And 40% of the milk given to schools is thrown away anyway.
It's not really a food system. It's like a money laundering system. I don't know. In order to keep these companies like Cargill in business, because if we had a system that was really truly about getting food to everyone, getting everyone's nutritional needs met, we wouldn't be feeding grain to animals and then having people buy milk
wasting
and meat.
All of our farmland to produce alfalfa to feed cows instead of, like 1/3 of our arable land goes to grow crops to feed animals when we could be growing crops to feed ourselves. And a lot of the water from the Colorado River goes to irrigate alfalfa pastures to grow alfalfa for cows. And it's incredibly wasteful.
So what has been the response like from the veterinary profession to bird flu?
There's a small minority of my colleagues who are very supportive of me. I was just recognized by the Vet Candy media outlet as like one of the most influential veterinarians of the year, which is very good. But also a lot of people, like the industry people, have been very hostile towards me, saying that, even just me taking pictures of dead cows and talking to the media, like they're just feeding into this narrative that I should have my license revoked.
Why? Because isn't public health the veterinarian's concern?
You would think, but they're saying I'm making life hard for dairy veterinarians. And when I ask how, there's my colleagues are spreading rumors that I was trespassing, all sorts of things. One of my colleagues who said on this big farming page with over 1 million followers, this person says, this vet should have her license revoked. Posting photos like this are a breach of confidentiality. If your medical doctor was doing this, they'd be facing criminal charges. Interesting. They want to compare our patients to people here because we wouldn't be raising and killing people, our patients, for food, for profit. that wouldn't be a thing. But also, I was not their veterinarian. I was merely a citizen driving down the road and seeing piles of dead cows. Talked to the CDF, California Department of Food and Agriculture, and expressed my concerns. They didn't seem to care, so I talked about it to the media.
Okay, but what is behind the veterinary community being so anti making this public?
It's like this weird culture of some of the people who view anybody who criticizes animal agriculture as out to cause them harm. This is just a very pattern.
Your job is to kiss the boots of your employers. Your job is to be a supplicant to your corporate overlords, not expose, important information about public health.
Yeah, it would seem that we were groomed that way since vet school to not question, especially farmers. It's like when one of the vet students told me this story about, they give a scenario that the vet students have to talk about. And one was like this farmer who had this cow with like this injury, and the farmer didn't want to pay for anything to take care of the cow or whatever. And it was like all how to like kind of assuage the farmer and all of these things and do what you can with the money you have, and et cetera. Then there's a scenario of like a person with a dog who they were neglecting their dog and didn't want to provide the vet care and whatever. And it was like, call animal control on them. All this, like, it was stark, the contrast. Like the farmer, you're not allowed to call animal control.
So the farmer who is a multi-millionaire.
Well, yeah.
We must make the multi-millionaire very comfortable. But the individual who's likely a poor first person who is working several jobs just to make ends meet and care for their family and their dog. They don't have, they're struggling to keep everything. Yeah. And they're like, the full extent of the law on them.
You have like this old lady who's trying to take care of all these animals and she becomes a hoarder. Mm-hmm. Like it's like clasper and handcuffs. And then you have literal hoarders who are corporations who are not taking care of their animals and having disease outbreaks. And it's like, no, we have to give them bailout money.
Yeah. Like, who are hoarding like the food that people need. And our grocery bills are crazy. I have a good job, but like things are really, really, really expensive. And it's really, really, really expensive because of these ag companies, and they're getting government subsidies, and they're getting all the coddling from the veterinary industry.
It's crazy because like we pay them $38 billion a year in subsidies to animal agriculture. And we also, just Americans, pay $38 billion a year to take care of our animals, like for veterinary care for our pets. We could have free healthcare for all dogs and cats if we removed subsidies to animal agriculture, which doesn't actually lower the cost of food. It just goes to enrich billionaire oligarchs. It doesn't lower the cost of food. We think all these subsidies are, doing that. No, it doesn't. It just goes straight to the executives. We could fund all veterinary care for all pets across the United States if we just redirected that funding.
And not to mention, we could have like no starving people. We could have no homeless people.
Yeah.
Everyone could be taken care of, but our government is taking our taxpayer money and giving it to the billionaires to make them even more billionaire-y.
Yep, that's true.
And
if you speak out about it and point it out, you're viewed as the one out to cause harm.
Which is like a dysfunctional family. Right?
Exactly.
Like that's what our whole like system is right now. It's a very dysfunctional family. And it's like in a dysfunctional family, you have the abusive father, and the patriarchy princess mother is like, oh no, we have to coddle him, right? Yeah. As much as he's terrorizing everyone else, we have to coddle him and take care of him. And the veterinary industry is like, oh, we have to coddle the farmers.
Poor farmers, they work so hard.
The corporations, we have to coddle them. And
literally, like I was barred from attending the AVMA's Humane Ending Symposium. And when the media reached out and asked why me and other veterinarians were barred, it was so that producers could have a safe space to discuss mass extermination methods used without fear of retribution. When it's like, literally, I am the one suffering retribution for having this perspective.
And it's the person in the dysfunctional family who calls out the dysfunctional family that gets the brunt of the abuse and the ostracization and everything. And it's the person in the veterinary industry who calls out the problems that gets ostracized. And in like the political system, it's the person that calls out the problem that gets ostracized. So what's the solution? The only thing I can think of is just like awareness and empowering people who don't have power.
Yeah. I mean, it's great that like media outlets like Vet Candy are rewarding people like me for speaking out. And even I'm getting media attention. So that's something like people can see, oh, this veterinarian is criticizing this, and she's published in Time Magazine and the New York Times and Vanity Fair and The Guardian and Reuters, and like legitimate, like, and she's doing fine. Like, and the more people see that, the more they'll be like, oh, okay, I can speak out now too. I can question these systems.
I really hope that we enter an era where instead of it being like the person that does the thing and calls out the thing and is taking action being ostracized, the person who does the thing gets lauded as an outlaw hero who is standing alone.
Literally so many scenarios in life, workplaces, organizations all have the same pattern of institutional betrayal, of like the one person who is voicing concerns is the one who is retaliated against, loses opportunities, bullied. And the way we overcome that is fostering institutional courage. We show people how to recognize the patterns, and we put systems in place to protect whistleblowers, and organizations apologize for wrongdoing, and all of the things. And I hope that's the future.
What do you recommend people do in the months ahead to protect themselves from bird flu?
Well, get a flu vaccine and don't touch any dead birds. Don't eat raw dairy, eggs, meat. I would recommend you try to avoid those products from your diet altogether, because you might not have those in the future. So get used to not having to eat those things. But, for now, they say cooked and pasteurized milk is safe, but the production methods used to make those products are certainly not safe. And if we get to the point where you're seeing human to human infection, might have to mask. I would recommend removing your shoes before coming in the house, because if you track in poultry feces or bird feces that you pick up on the street, and if you have cats and they could potentially get sick from that, who knows? We don't really know, but I just think it's a good idea.
So like if your cat goes outside, it's like an indoor-outdoor cat.
I would recommend keeping your cat inside, because they could eat a avian influenza infected wild bird and they could get sick and die. So it's like 89% of cats with this virus die. So take it very seriously. Yeah.
That actually reminds me, someone at the barn had a cat that got randomly sick with a really serious virus. They had no idea what the virus was. They did a test for all the things. And I said, did you test for bird flu? And they said no. And the cat pulled through, but I wonder if it was bird flu. This happened like a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, get them tested for bird flu. Inform your vet, because a lot of vets still aren't thinking about it. And Tamiflu, I guess, helps the cats recover. So
that's good.
And antibiotics. I mean, if you're interested about hearing more, go to ourhonor.org, sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social media, Our Honor Vets on all of the platforms, and follow me on Twitter at Dr. Crystal Heath, because that's where I post most updates about avian influenza. So check it out.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. And I'll drop all that info in the show notes.
Cool.
Thank you.
Until
next time. Bye.